Good afternoon. My name is Chuck Larrabee. I'm on the Albuquerque Historical Society board. And as somebody who was raised in Albuquerque in the 50s and 60s, I spent quite a bit of time. Harry, be quiet.
Sorry.
Anyway, as somebody who was born and raised in Albuquerque, I spent quite a bit of time down at the Alvarado Hotel. My dad worked downtown, so when we got a little bit older, my mom would pile my two sisters and me in the car, and we'd go down to meet my dad for lunch at the Alvarado lunchroom. And generally my mom and dad would have something to talk about. I don't know what it was, but they say, why don't you kids just go out and play? So they would let us go out in the gardens and we'd explore it. And if we were really brave, we'd sneak into the Indian room and go back. I'm sure many of you have similar experiences, right? So we've all got experiences at the Alvarado Hotel. I had warm memories of the Alvarado. So when it was threatened, in '69, I ended up, when I joke around with people, I say, you know, all my friends were out marching against the war in Vietnam, civil rights or something. I was marching down Central Avenue trying to save the Alvarado. And so first, we were up against tremendous odds between the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company and trying to save the hotel. But this will be the first of two presentations this year on the Alvarado. We thought it was important to cover the Alvarado, and you were the lucky ones because I think we turned away an equal number of people who weren't able to get in today. So, so this is first of two presentations. Today's presentation will cover really the history of the hotel. And then in September 22nd, we've had some issues with the date, so make sure you put that down. September 22nd. Joe McKinney, who's over here, who many of you know, who's a local architect and historian, who was very instrumental in the citizens' efforts to help save the Alvarado. He and I'll be doing a presentation again, that'll be September 22nd, on the efforts. It was the final days of the Alvarado, plus the tremendous efforts that went into a citizens group to try to save the hotel. And if any of you have some insight into that, we're involved, that we'd love to talk to you after the presentation. Anyway, today's presentation will be on the history of the Alvarado Hotel. Matt Kluge from Central Illinois is going to be doing it, depending on how our technology was working this afternoon. I've known Matt for quite a while. He is a regular speaker at the Fred Harvey weekend sponsored by the New Mexico History Museum. Done an excellent job and has done some great presentations on everything from the Ortiz and Lamy to La Fonda, and did a very thorough presentation last year on the Montezuma and the Castaneda in Las Vegas. So Matt is a rail fan, an architect as well, lives in Central Illinois. Again, he'll be doing more presentations for Fred Harvey weekend. If you're interested in that, get together. That happens every fall, and go through the website for the New Mexico History Museum. So as Stephen Freed, who wrote Appetite for America and who hosts the Fred Harvey weekend every year, says, Matt Kluge is also one of the very few young people interested in Fred Harvey. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to, from Central Illinois, here's Matt Kluge. Fingers crossed.
Thanks, Chuck. So let's get started here. All right. The Alvarado Hotel was once the centerpiece of Albuquerque social life, as well as the Fred Harvey chain of hotels and restaurants. It characterized a version of Southwest design based on Mission Revival style architecture. The iconic Fred Harvey Indian building was located here. Even though the hotel is gone, it is preserved in terms of original drawings and photographs, from which we can get a sense of how it changed over time before being demolished 68 years after it opened. For a century, Fred Harvey's presence in Albuquerque was mirrored by the trends across the country. I'll start off with a brief overview of the Fred Harvey Company. Frederick Henry Harvey immigrated to the United States from England in 1853 at the age of 17. After working various jobs in the restaurant and railroad industries, In 1876, he agreed to operate a small dining room within the Topeka Depot of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. His primary goal was to provide a more comfortable dining experience than that typically found among railroads in the West, where trains had to stop for meals because there were no dining cars. The venture proved to be a success, and after Harvey took over several other eating houses along the Santa Fe, he became the railroad's official concessionaire along its entire route. Together, the two entities boosted the tourism industry at the Grand Canyon, weathered a myriad of different economic downturns, and served soldiers and civilians alike during multiple wars. When the Santa Fe began to introduce dining cars to its trains, Harvey would run them too. By the 1950s, travel preferences had changed and most of the trackside eating houses were gone. In 1968, the Harvey family sold the company's AmFac, which is now known as Xanterra Parks and Resorts, and continues to run the concessions at the Grand Canyon National Park. But back in 1878, shortly after Fred Harvey first partnered with the Santa Fe, the railroad was crossing Raton Pass into New Mexico. From there, it built south toward Las Vegas, Albuquerque, and the Mexican border. Their goal was the port of Guaymas, Mexico, and the business it would hopefully generate for the railroad. Albuquerque at the time was a small city without much importance to the Santa Fe. Soon, the Santa Fe and Frisco railroads partnered in the construction of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. Even though it was controlled by the same people as the Santa Fe, the line from Albuquerque west to California was constructed and operated by the A&P. The Santa Fe's passenger trains went south from Albuquerque, not west. Passengers headed to California had to change trains in Albuquerque for the rest of their trip. The first permanent depot built in Albuquerque was completed in the spring of 1882, 2 years after the Santa Fe arrived in the city. It was a wood building containing men's and women's waiting rooms, an agent's office, and additional offices on the second floor. The two-story section was flanked to the north with a covered waiting area and to the south with a baggage room. However, there was no Harvey Eating House in Albuquerque. Old Santa Fe timetables reveal that the meal stops were established north and south of Albuquerque, and the A&P had their closest eating house at Coolidge, New Mexico, near Gallup. As early as 1886, rumors were floated that the Santa Fe would erect a large depot hotel in Albuquerque, but this was not to be. The Santa Fe and Fred Harvey finally established a small eating house in Albuquerque in February of 1888. The railroad provided 2 coaches to house the facility, and Ford Harvey, son of Fred Harvey, oversaw the preparation of the cars. This would serve the city until 1892, when a permanent eating house was constructed. To the best of my knowledge, no pictures showing the full building exist, but the Sanborn map indicates it was a single-story wood frame structure with large overhanging eaves. As a note, all plans that you'll see will be oriented, so north is to your right. There are 2 photos that I found that show a portion of the eating house. These reveal several details that were standard on Santa Fe buildings, including the peaked window trim and one of the railroad's standard eave bracket designs. At the time, the railroad painted their buildings a deep maroon, so it is likely the Harvey House was as well. This small eating house would be enlarged slightly in 1897. The 1880s were a period of expansion for the Santa Fe under the leadership of William Barstow Strong, with the small regional railroad expanding from Chicago to California and down to Texas and Mexico. The 1890s were not so friendly, with a worldwide depression beginning in 1893, heavily affecting the fortunes of America's railroads, including the Santa Fe. With the general loss of business, combined with the debt from the previous decade's expansion, the railroad went bankrupt. In 1895, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad reemerged as the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, under the leadership of Edward Payson Ripley. Ripley was left with the task of stabilizing the company and rebuilding its image among the areas that it served. Part of this included replacing the utilitarian wooden eating houses with new buildings, showing off the railroad's strength and serving as a goodwill sign towards the cities where they were built. The first new Harvey houses were built in La Junta and Dodge City in 1895 and 1898, respectively. In 1899, the Castaneda was completed in Las Vegas. marking the railroad's first use of Mission Revival-style architecture for a Harvey House. The Castaneda, with its mission-style exterior and Victorian interior, was obviously a transition for the Santa Fe and Fred Harvey away from the European styles seen previously to the Mission Revival style. Mission Revival has its roots in the missions built by the Spanish in the, quote, New World. Historically, there were three trends in mission architecture depending on the region: Mexico, New Mexico, or California. Each region had slight differences. When the Mission Revival style was developed in California during the 1890s, architects found inspiration in the California flavor. Architectural elements which came to define the style included the use of stucco, clay tile roofs, archways and arcades, gables with curvilinear parapets, accent windows with a round or quatrefoil shape, and tiered bell towers. This was a vocabulary of pieces which architects combined in various ways to create their designs. As Mission Revival was growing in popularity in California, the Santa Fe was coming out of its financial turmoil and looking for ways to rebuild its brand. One way of doing this was through tourism. Initially, this meant the promotion of health resorts, as well as the climate of so-called winterless California. Soon, trains and Harvey houses took on names that evoked the Southwest, and mission-style architecture turned the second generation of Harvey houses into visual advertisements of the region, bringing the most picturesque elements, like the ruins above, to the traveling public. In the late 1800s, Albuquerque was booming, and the citizens felt that the small eating house and old depot no longer fit their vision for the future of their city. In October of 1899, the city's commercial club asked the Santa Fe to construct a new depot and hotel that would reflect Albuquerque's growing size and importance. By the end of the month, the railroad announced their intentions to do just that, although given the short timeline, they had probably already been considering it. Railroad officials knew that the lack of quality hotels in the city forced tourists and health seekers to travel elsewhere, and a new depot hotel would undoubtedly boost the local economy and therefore the railroad's profits. The railroad and Fred Harvey publicized plans for the new building in April of 1900, but before construction could begin, several businesses that occupied land where the new hotel would go needed to be relocated, which took until October of 1900. To design the new complex, the railway turned to Chicago architect Charles F. Whittlesey. Born in 1867 in Alton, Illinois, Whittlesey left school in 1882 to find work in Chicago at the architecture firm of Addison and Fiedler, where he remained until around 1890 when he opened his own firm. In 1900, the Santa Fe hired Whittlesey to take over as company architect, a position which he held for 3 years. While employed by the railway, he completed designs for numerous stations, reading rooms, hospitals, and Harvey houses, some built, others not. In 1904, after his stint with the Santa Fe was over, Whittlesey moved to Los Angeles, where his interest in reinforced concrete grew. He helped Los Angeles rewrite their building code to accommodate concrete construction and assisted in the construction of reconstruction of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. Whittlesey's architectural career continued into the 1930s before he passed away in 1941. Construction commenced in late 1900 and after the site had been cleared and continued through 1901. The Alvarado is beginning to take shape on the right side of that photo. By January of 1902, the new hotel and depot were nearing completion. The hotel's name was derived from a member of Coronado's expedition party, Hernando de Alvarado. The Alvarado was finally opened on May 11, 1902. The total cost with furnishings was $125,000, or over $4.5 million today. The new hotel expanded on the concepts introduced at the Castaneda. The main hotel was roughly a U-shape, with an arcade surrounding the entire building, not just a portion like the Castaneda. The arcade extended south, connecting the hotel and depot. The complex also included the hotel annex to the south of the hotel, as well as a small building containing sample rooms, an express building for the Wells Fargo Company, and a new railroad freight house. The expression of the Mission Revival style on the exterior of all buildings which form the new complex was much more thorough and typical than the version displayed at the Castaneda. All the decorative elements could be traced back to the California missions. The roof was actual clay tile instead of pressed metal. The towers were more typical than the original missions. And while the building was framed with timber like the Castaneda, it was finished in stucco rather than the brick veneer that was used in Las Vegas. On the ground floor, the north wing of the hotel contained the lobby, 2 small parlors, a writing room, a newsstand, a barber shop, and a bar. The west side of the U contained the main dining room, and the south wing contained the lunchroom and kitchens. The annex contained the hotel laundry, dormitory, and storage rooms. Where the interiors of the previous Harvey houses had all reflected a strong Victorian or neoclassical style, the Alvarado brought the Mission Revival inside. The hotel contained oak furnishings designed by Whittlesey that exhibited the simplicity inherent in the Mission Revival. Walls and ceilings were primarily painted earth colors that evoked the Southwest with shades of terracotta, orange, yellow, and olive green. These were offset by geometric patterned wallpapers and wood paneling. Here in the lobby, we see benches with X-brays that can be found in all of the original furniture, a horseshoe-shaped front desk, and a musician's balcony partway up the stairs for evening entertainment. On the left, one of the 2 parlors off the lobby, and then on the right, the newsstand was visible just at the left side of the image. The main dining room could seat 160 people and was brightly lit by windows on the east and west sides. The west wall also contained a massive fireplace. Walls had wood paneling for the bottom 2/3 with wallpaper above, and the room featured a coffered ceiling. The original lunchroom contained a single circular lunch counter made of wood with wood stools on cast iron bases. And behind the counter were 4 quarter circle display cases. One of the original bedrooms. Again, note the repetition of the X-brace throughout the furniture. In early promotional materials, the hotel grounds were hardly mentioned, and postcards depicted them as sparse. Plantings were limited to grass, some ivy, and a few trees in the north lawn. The focal point of the central courtyard was a multi-tiered fountain surrounded by a circular brick walk. These images have strong similarities to the images of mission ruins that were used in railroad advertising. The Indian building was not mentioned as part of the original concept for the hotel complex. However, Fred Harvey had begun collecting Native American artifacts as early as 1900. During the fall of 1901, they built a small so-called curio room in Williams, Arizona, where they began selling Native American arts. In early 1902, plans for the Indian building at the Alvarado were announced. The single name really consisted of 2 components: a museum space located between the depot and the hotel containing artifacts for display, and a smaller curio sales room located in a building that formed the fourth or east side of the central courtyard. These new components of the complex were not completed when the hotel opened in May. In June, the 2 functions were switched, giving the curio shop the larger building between the depot and hotel. Boxcars of merchandise began to arrive in mid-July 1902, and newspapers announced the arrival of George Dorsey from the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago to oversee the cataloging and display of the museum building. According to newspapers, about 10 people were assisting Dorsey. An important differentiation exists between the museum and sales room. It makes sense for an ethnographer like Dorsey to oversee the museum, but he probably wasn't heavily involved in the commercial sales room, where Mary Coulter and others were doing their work. Mary Coulter was a young woman living in Minnesota, teaching art and literature since 1892. In 1902, thanks to the efforts of one of her friends, she came to the Southwest to work on the Indian Building, her first project for Fred Harvey. She would become one of the primary designers employed by Fred Harvey until retiring in 1944. Her friend was Henrietta Hamilton, who lived in Seattle, where she was a collector and dealer in Native American baskets. In the spring of 1902, she had sold an assortment of baskets to Fred Harvey to help build up the company's collection. The two ladies met in Santa Fe for a couple of days before their summer in Albuquerque. It is unclear exactly what role Coulter had in the museum and sales room, but it was the start of a new career for her. The Indian and Mexican Building, to use the sales room's full name, consisted of a series of rooms along the arcade connecting the hotel and depot. Two arched doorways led into a large sales room with a fireplace centered on the west wall. To the north of the fireplace was a space reserved for native artist demonstrators, who became so popular that more space was dedicated south of the fireplace. The rest of the back half contained offices and storerooms. South of the main room were the blanket room, Spanish and Mexican room, and Pacific room. The main sales room of the Indian and Mexican Building. Note the price tags hanging from several of the baskets piled up towards the right side of the image, especially in that large view. It's unlikely that Coulter worked alone on the Indian Building, especially if 10 people assisted Dorsey on the much smaller museum space. One hint that Coulter was part of a group working on the Indian Building lies with her friend Henrietta Hamilton. An image of Hamilton's home appeared in an 1899 issue of Harper's Bazaar, showing a fishing net hanging from the ceiling, curiously like the net visible above the Indian Building's fireplace. Obviously, Hamilton probably was not the only person to do this, but it is coincidental. Postcard images on the left side show the original workroom at the top and the second workroom at the bottom. On the right is an image showing the blanket room taken from a promotional booklet. Here we see the Spanish and Mexican room with slightly different products than those displayed in the other rooms. Even the swords on the table were for sale. The Alvarado hosted one of its earliest famous guests in 1903 when then-President Teddy Roosevelt visited. From that point on, public officials, movie stars, and foreign dignitaries would all call on the Alvarado. Everyday people also enjoyed the hotel, whether it was for Sunday dinner, the local social club gathering, or small corporate conventions. To help accommodate some of these various social functions, a new private dining room had been created by 1909, which was christened Taft Hall after President Taft. To form Taft Hall, the arcade along the west side of the main dining room was enclosed, as can be seen here. By 1912, the popularity of the Indian department had exploded, with Fred Harvey now managing the sales room and museum buildings in Albuquerque, the Hopi House at Grand Canyon, rooms at Williams and Ash Fork, Arizona, and other Harvey hotels. The department needed more space, so the railroad constructed a small one-story building south of the hotel annex. Built out of reinforced concrete, which by then had become the railroad's preferred building material, it continued the stylistic choices employed at the Alvarado. The original complex only contained one newsstand to serve hotel guests and train passengers, located off the hotel lobby. This was inconvenient for railroad passengers and likely caused large crowds to gather in the lobby. Meanwhile, the museum building saw very few visitors, as they were likely to either visit the, quote, gift shop in the Indian Building or go into the hotel itself. In 1915, Fred Harvey combined the museum with an additional newsstand. The central portion of the structure was turned into a newsstand, while museum displays were relegated to the smaller north and south rooms before being squeezed out entirely. By 1920, the hotel was unable to handle the demands placed on it as Albuquerque grew in importance, and more events were held in the city. Fred Harvey had to limit the duration of stays to 3 days in order to keep the turnover of rooms high enough, so the Santa Fe and Fred Harvey launched a building program to update and enlarge the hotel. Guest rooms were added, the lobby was remodeled, the lunchroom remodeled and expanded, a new laundry building was built, and the hotel annex and kitchens were renovated. Construction was set to begin January 1st of 1922, and by the end of April, it was estimated work would take 2 more months, but delays plagued the project, and it took until mid-September for guest rooms to finally be ready. The new addition to the north was essentially an L shape, which created another courtyard area. The addition was constructed from the now standard reinforced concrete and contained 2 levels of guest rooms, with additional guest rooms and service functions in the lowest level. Unlike the existing hotel, it did not have an arcade. Instead, it was treated rather plainly, with only some balconies and the same curvilinear parapet to break up the facade. It was finished in stucco with a red tile roof, in keeping with the existing Mission Revival building. Furniture in each guest room included either 2 twin beds or 1 full bed, a dresser and mirror, an easy chair with a reading lamp, and a desk. Wood of choice for furnishings was walnut, and upholstery coordinated with each room's color scheme. Guest room color schemes varied from black and yellow to pink and blue. One guest room was fully described in the Albuquerque Journal as having wallpaper with a golden brown and green color, curtains with black and red stripes, and an armchair upholstered in orange fabric. I'm not sure how it worked out, but the Journal stated that it was, quote, a daring combination successfully achieved. The lowest level of the new addition contained a new event space for the hotel. It was a large room at the northwest corner of the addition. The plaster walls were accented with light woodwork and wrought iron fixtures. Also on this floor were additional guest rooms as well as new sample rooms for traveling salesmen. Each sample room had a glass wall along the corridor, allowing display of items. A private bedroom was attached to each sample room, giving a traveling salesman his own suite. This floor also contained a new men's restroom. There were no public women's restrooms at the time. A new barbershop, a beauty shop, and a stenographer's room. Excuse me. After the new wing was completed, attention was turned to the lobby renovations. In the remodel, the entire north wing of the original building was turned into lobby space, subdivided into 4 parts. A wall separated the hotel offices at the west end from the lobby proper, and the remaining space was divided into a large seating area, a writing room, and a fireplace lounge, each separated by arched partitions with wood spindle screens. The fireplace was built into the east wall. Part of the original north arcade was filled in to create a new newsstand, as well as entry vestibule from First Street to the west. The original wood floors were replaced with tile. Corners of each column in the room were decorated with tile coining, capped off by lion capitals. The fireplace mantel featured a large tile plaque in the shape of Alvarado's crest. Furnishings displayed a Spanish colonial theme, constructed of wood and wrought iron of varying designs. Wrought iron light fixtures, plants in large clay and metal pots, and drapes hanging from wrought iron curtain rods rounded out a thoroughly Spanish interior. The renovated lunchroom opened in early September of 1922. The original lunch counter was replaced with 2 U-shaped counters, increasing the stool count from 36 to 60. The arcade along the south side of the lunchroom was enclosed, allowing table service to be added. Excuse me. The room was finished with a quarry tile floor, a tile wainscot consisting of brown and blue tiles, and plaster above. Spaced periodically throughout the wainscot were tile H's. While not called for in the original drawings, This is an interesting way to brand the room for Fred Harvey. The public side of the lunch counter was finished in the same tiles as the walls, and countertop was made of thick black glass. Behind the counter were 4 display refrigerators finished in bronze and tile. Coffee urns were moved into the kitchen, with spouts through the wall from which Harvey girls would pour coffee. The new wing of the hotel created a second courtyard area with opportunities for additional gardens. After construction was completed, the space around the hotel began to be transformed into more heavily planted gardens, as compared to the original simple lawns. The new courtyard featured flagstone paths, hedges and shrubs, and a large reflecting pool, while the existing central courtyard received new flowering bushes and trees. The final renovations were for the service side of the operation. The kitchen was remodeled, expanding the bakery into the arcade that wrapped around the kitchen, meaning the entire south and most of the west sides of the building had lost the original open arcade. The original laundry in the annex was sized to handle only 5,000 pieces a day, coming from 5 Harvey hotels and the railroad dining cars. With the increasing number of soiled linens from the expanded Alvarado and other hotels, a separate laundry building was built near the depot, freeing up space in the annex for repair shops, print shops, excuse me, and additional storage rooms. The new laundry building was built of reinforced concrete and continued the Mission Revival theme. Most decorative features on the building were reserved for a tower on the southeast corner, including balconies and arched windows, which disguised a large cistern. The expanded laundry employed 50 people when it was completed, operating until about 1960 before being demolished in 1962. Following these renovations, the Alvarado's interior entered a new phase. Where the original interiors were arts and crafts style, the newly completed interiors exhibited a reliance on the Spanish colonial revival. Excuse me. This was a theme throughout the Harvey system in the 1920s and was exhibited in architectural trends across the country. While the Mission Revival had been popular at the turn of the century, by the 1920s, architects began to turn to more similar styles. Spanish colonial revival, with its wide array of design elements, was gaining in popularity and used in the remodeled Harvey House. The Alvarado is now poised to be an anchor in Fred Harvey's next great tourism endeavor, the Indian, excuse me, the Indian detours. The original detour ran from Las Vegas to Albuquerque with trips based out of Santa Fe. While the Alvarado's relationship with the Indian detours paled in comparison with La Fonda's, it was nonetheless an important piece of the puzzle. Its collection of artifacts in the Indian building would have helped provide context for the sights seen along the detours, and the items for sale at the Indian building would have given detourists a chance to purchase souvenirs had they not done so during the trip. Pardon me. By the excuse me. By the 1930s, Albuquerque's downtown was becoming congested. The population was at 26,000 and was growing steadily, and traffic downtown was made worse when trains passed through, because they crossed Central Avenue at grade. By 1933, the city was looking for ways to alleviate the gridlock, and the solution was to grade separate the automobiles and trains. Delayed by politics, the project did not get underway until mid-1936. To create the underpass, the railroad was raised about 6 feet, while the street was lowered. Along with the raised railroad tracks, new platforms needed to be constructed, as well as retaining walls in front of the Alvarado. In the process, the old museum building was demolished. The vista across the railroad tracks to the full height of the Alvarado was now half blocked by retaining walls, and the hotel's grounds became sunken gardens. In place of the old museum building, a patio was created with a fountain incorporated into the new retaining wall. In 1939, a new arrangement with the Santa Fe allowed Fred Harvey to operate the hotels more independently of the railroad. This meant Fred Harvey could better cater to the local communities, as well as solicit business from non-railroad travelers, leading to different ways of advertising their hotels. At the same time, Fred Harvey announced several changes, including the creation of a warehouse and truck department, and renovations at many of the affected hotels. With the new arrangement, the railroad no longer transported Fred Harvey's supplies free of charge, leading Fred Harvey to establish a warehouse and truck department based in Albuquerque. This department would unload items shipped by the railroad and transport them to locations along the line between Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon, giving Harvey a central distribution point and cutting charges for shipping by rail to each location. This operation lasted at least into the 1950s. At the Alvarado, the new agreement also led to the creation of a cocktail lounge at the hotel. The popularity of cocktails had grown secretly during Prohibition, and when restrictions were lifted in 1933, hotels and restaurants took advantage of the consumption of cocktails by adding new rooms dedicated to the pastime. These were referred to as cocktail lounges and often made use of modern or streamlined styles. Talk of adding cocktail lounges to the Fred Harvey system began as early as 1934, and one of the first in the system opened in 1937 as part of the remodeled Kansas City Union Station restaurant, the Westport Room. In the late 1930s, cocktail lounges were to be added at several other Harvey locations as well. Plans for the Alvarado's cocktail lounge were likely done by Fred Harvey's in-house team of Robert Rainey and Mary Coulter. Taft Hall, the private dining room, was added onto, doubling the width of the old space. The lounge took up half the length of the space, while the other half was retained as a remodeled private dining room. The focal point of the lounge was a fireplace alcove constructed at the south end of the room. The brick floor of the arcade was retained, and a brick wainscot extended up the walls. Brick columns replaced the original arches of the arcade, with new arched windows in the new wall. The half-circle windows featured hand-painted designs with figures and floral motifs. A tile-faced bar was constructed at the north end of the room, and wall decorations consisted of Spanish proverbs made of tile inlaid in the plaster walls and 10 wall sconces. The fireplace alcove was fashioned to resemble a kitchen and was decorated with gourds, ristras, and antique cookware. Tables and chairs of various designs, all within the Spanish colonial style, filled out the space. Of course, every good cocktail lounge deserves a name, so the new space was called La Cocina Cantina. Next door, the private dining room was received some upgrades as well. Walls in the room were covered in murals attributed to Olive Rush, depicting Coronado's expedition to New Mexico, and the room was renamed the Alvarado Room. While never fully documented, bits of mural can be seen in various photos. We do know that the murals contain scenes of Coronado's arrival at Luni Pueblo, the battle at Acoma, and battle scenes from Gran Quivira, as well as a part of a letter Coronado wrote saying, quote, "We do not find the treasures of which we have been told, but we found a fair land in which to dwell." West of the new spaces, a wall was built enclosing a small patio named La Placita. The patio was finished with flagstone and featured planters, steel patio chairs and tables, wrought iron handrails, and wrought iron lamps. Trees in the patio and along First Street give the space a canopy of dappled sunlight. Meanwhile, the main dining room was also remodeled. As expressed in several newspaper articles, Fred Harvey had to be sensitive when making changes to the dining room. Pardon me. Because so many people in Albuquerque had special memories associated with the space. Even the high chairs provided saw multiple generations of the same family. At some point, possibly during the 1933 renovation, the dining room's fireplace was modified. The scale was reduced and a new Spanish colonial mantel was installed. The original wood floors were covered with linoleum tiles, and the light fixtures were updated as well to those seen on the left. World War II brought some changes to the operation of the Alvarado. For instance, chefs in the kitchen were now saving waste fats for use in explosives, contributing 100 pounds weekly. Rationing also meant some innovation in the kitchen, such as Alvarado pastry chef Alois Hoffman's dessert, Appelette. Finding himself short on cream, sugar, and butter, Hoffman developed a new dessert based on powdered, dehydrated apples, mixed with eggs, sugar, and water, then frozen to achieve a consistency similar to ice cream. Huge numbers of troops were passing by, needing to be fed, too many to be served in the hotel's existing facilities, so Fred Harvey turned once again to the arcade. The arches were quickly filled in with just small casement windows to let in light, one of which is visible behind the boy's head in this image. Pardon me. Turning the length of the arcade along two sides of the courtyard into a temporary dining room. This would be space for an estimated 200 soldiers to eat. The change was temporary, and the open arcade was restored after the war. The first major change after the war was at the Indian Building, which remained essentially unchanged since it opened. A major facelift of the facility began in 1945, leaving it transformed from the dark, heavily decorated space it was, with walls now covered in white plaster, archways expanded into rectangular openings, and display cases for museum pieces. Souvenirs available for purchase were now stacked on shelves, credenzas, or in glass sales counters, and the original fireplace was modified. In all, the room appears more like a modern gift shop. The entrance was also revised at this time, replacing the original two arches with a single monumental archway, which made the entrance more identifiable, but it was no longer in scale architecturally with the rest of the building. The hotel staff had also run out of space behind the front desk, so nearly the last of the arcade on the west side of the building was enclosed to form additional offices. At the same time, the first street entrance to the hotel was revised, joining two of the smaller arches into a single arch, similar to what had been done at the Indian Building. On October 1st, 1948, Fred Harvey took over the operations of the restaurant at Albuquerque's airport, as well as the cocktail lounge and flight kitchen, expanding the company's footprint in Albuquerque. This was Fred Harvey's first airport facility, and the first time they were serving meals in the air since the 1930s. Over 38 flights a day out of Albuquerque were serving Fred Harvey meals. The next year, Fred Harvey also took over operations of the curio shop at the municipal airport, meaning they controlled all concessions at the facility. In the 1950s, the Alvarado guest rooms received a facelift and plumbing and light fixtures were updated, although perhaps lacking the Southwest charm of the previous decorations. One morning in 1954, the lobby ceiling collapsed. This is likely the time the ceilings in the lobby and dining room were lowered, covering the original trim work. Air conditioning was added to the hotel in 1954, which is another possible explanation for the lowered ceilings, and each guest room window now had an air conditioner taking up part of it. The two color images are from the 1960s, with the flying saucer light fixtures, stackable vinyl covered chairs, and red leather sofas in the lobby. The old-fashioned Southwest charm of La Cocina Cantina had fallen out of favor with Fred Harvey management, and in 1954 they replaced it with the mid-century modern cocktail lounge named the Spotlight Room. Not a single element from La Cantina was retained. As arched windows were covered over, fireplace was replaced by a stone veneer, the ceiling was lowered, and the focal point became a sculpture by Herb Goldman, illuminated by spotlights. Furnishing screened modern, complete with built-in ashtrays in the table. A new entrance to the bar was built facing First Street. Rather than attempt to blend with the hotel's Mission Revival architecture, the designers tacked on a modern canopy with metal edging, narrow tube spindles, recessed lights, and a cursive neon sign proclaiming the new Spotlight Room. While the design clashed with the rest of the Alvarado, it demonstrated Fred Harvey's system-wide trend towards the modern. Pardon me. This could be seen no matter the designer, and any connection to Southwestern heritage and future projects was extremely limited. A 1961 article in the Albuquerque Journal illustrated how changing travel patterns and tastes were hurting the Alvarado and other downtown hotels. These facilities could not attract visitors who traveled by car. They lacked the huge event spaces to host conventions that newer hotels had. Owners of the downtown hotels that did try to modernize did not see a return on their investments. Downtown areas across the country were also being abandoned as newer shopping centers opened on the edges of towns. The businesses in downtowns moved out, and old buildings were demolished in hopes that new ones would replace them. The 1961 article specifically notes the Alvarado's location next to First Street decay. By the mid-1960s, the Alvarado had lost a lot of its interior charm, and the exterior needed paint and a thorough cleaning. The gardens were beginning to show signs of neglect. Fire escapes, air conditioners, and exhaust fans littered the exterior of the building. Back in 1953, the hotels and restaurants outside of Grand Canyon and the Union stations only made up 13% of Fred Harvey's revenue. The Alvarado was 5%. Now, Fred Harvey was running only 2 hotels outside of national parks, the Alvarado and La Fonda, and it was clear that Fred Harvey was getting out of the trackside hotel business. Instead, they were shifting to a business model based on automobile traffic, Union Station shops and restaurants, and the tourism of the Grand Canyon. In 1965, they moved the Western Retail Division offices from the Alvarado to Grand Canyon, including Fred Harvey's Indian and Fine Arts collection. Albuquerque opened its new airport, the Sunport, in 1965, and Fred Harvey's facilities there were expanded greatly. They were now operating retail shops, a coffee shop, 2 cocktail lounges, a snack bar, a stand-up bar, a banquet room, and a new, larger version of the Cantina Room, the name given to the restaurant in the old airport. In all, it was an investment by Fred Harvey of $450,000 in new facilities away from the railroad and away from downtown. As another sign of Fred Harvey moving on for the Alvarado, by 1967, they were in talks with city leaders about operating a motel at the airport, which the city hoped to build. In 1968, Fred Harvey was sold to AmFac, and while AmFac had plans for the Grand Canyon, the rest of the Harvey system was in limbo. This coincided with the termination of Harvey's contract to operate Santa Fe's dining cars, and the sale of La Fonda to the Ballin family. Early in 1969, the Alvarado's liquor license was transferred to a property near Old Town, where the owners were planning to build a motel that would be leased to Fred Harvey, while negotiations for a Sunport Hotel continued. In the summer of 1969, the Alvarado was added to the National Register of Historic Places, which, while it highlights buildings of historic value, does not prevent their demolition. However, the hotel was not the same place as it had once been. The hotel faced the railroad, but most guests now arrived by car. The back of the hotel, which they encountered first, had become a conglomeration of additions and remodels, and First Street had been widened so much there was only room for a sidewalk between it and the hotel, no landscaping. The annex suffered from leaking roofs and sagging floors. Fred Harvey was making plans to move, and the railroad would soon be left without a tenant for the space. At the beginning of June 1969, the lunchroom was closed abruptly. The planned closure of the hotel was announced on September 19th, 1969, effective January 2nd of 1970. The Alvarado was in peril, but that's another story. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Excellent, and probably much more detail than you were expecting, right? Okay, I'm here to take some questions. We have over 10 people on Facebook as well. If you have any questions, please submit them on the Q&A on Facebook or comments on Facebook. Do we have any questions here in the audience? I see one here next to the aisle.
So when they went to the new airport, did townspeople go out there for lunch or dinner? I remember going to the old airport after church on Sunday and sitting out there on a patio, having lunch and watching the planes come in.
Matt, the question related to, did the population of Albuquerque move out to the airport as well as those restaurants were developed?
Yeah. After the Fred Harvey moved to the new airport, people went and had lunch and dinner at the Kachina room, just as they had when it was in the old airport as well.
The old airport was wonderful. My brother and I were there, sticking our fingers in all the coin returns of the telephones. We walked out of there with money every time.
You on that one. Any other questions? We have a question here.
Could you talk a little bit about the person who did the murals at the Alvarado? Was that the same? Did that have anything to do with the murals at the Mazo building?
Yes.
Was there any relationship between the murals in
The
the
same people involved?
Maizales as did
Right, the murals that you talked about at the
the
Alvarado.
murals at the Alvarado? Specialist with the Maizales. We did.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
According to Joe McKinnon. Matt, do you have any insight into that?
I don't remember for sure who did the murals at Maisels. Was it Olive Rush? If it was,
I'm getting nods in the audience, yeah.
Yes.
And her team.
And the old airport, and
the old airport.
Actually,
Actually, at the old airport, according to Joe. And I'm seeing nods in the audience here, so we have a knowledgeable audience. I have a question for you, Matt. Still not seeing anything on Facebook. There was a fellow in town known as the Fig Man who was selling fig trees. He claimed were taken from fig trees that were, these are branches that were taken from fig trees that were grown by the chefs. That were grown in the gardens at the Alvarado. Do you have any information relative to what the chefs may have been growing in terms of food for cooking at the Alvarado? And more than fig trees?
I don't specifically, but I do remember seeing a newspaper article from relatively recently about a fig tree in Albuquerque that was supposed to be from a cutting from one at the Alvarado. Probably the same person.
Okay. Any other questions? You have one in the front here?
When the Alvarado was torn down, did any of that wonderful millwork get saved or reused?
Did any of the millwork in the Alvarado get saved when it was torn down? This may be, Joe may have some insight into this as well. Matt?
Yes. Lots of tile or other pieces from throughout the Alvarado got saved and were repurposed quite often, it seems, in people's houses. They purchased a section of tile from the lunchroom maybe and had a few hours to go in and scrape that tile off the wall, and then one person who did that reused it as a step inside their house.
I have a question from Mr. McKinney.
No, a statement.
A statement.
A statement. Coronado Wrecking received the demolition contract. They set up in the lobby area, tables with their people. You were invited to come in and remove anything you wanted to. Bring your hammer, your crowbars, whatever. Remove anything that you wanted to, but you had to go by their desk and pay them what they thought it was worth.
He's describing some of the demolition, saving some of the material. We'll be able to cover that on the presentation in September.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned and arrive early for that presentation. Any other questions? I have one here.
The sculpturing work that was in one of those dining rooms, I guess it was like Herb Goldman.
Herb Goldman sculptures in the dining room.
Yeah, there was one large one that I saw the picture of.
Large one, there was a picture.
That was a friend of mine, a girlfriend of mine, that was her dad. And she had often wondered what had ever happened, you know, because she never.
To the large statue
No, it was, actually, it was a big
or sculpture?
metal sculpture.
Big metal sculpture. Wondering what happened to it.
I have no idea.
Joe McKinney says he
No, I don't know, but Herb Goldman had his studio on Isleta, I think. And he was the designer of the sculptural elephant wall at the Rio Grande Zoo. He also worked at the San Diego Zoo along with their projects. And at the University of New Mexico, on Coronel Mall, that fountain, just before you go to the College of Education, Herb did that.
And one more question and then we'll convene.
In various images that I saw, the Indians sat around in the courtyard
Indians in the courtyard.
selling their handicrafts.
Selling the handicrafts.
And that didn't show in any, they weren't just in the Indian building. Am I correct about that?
Okay, I don't understand the Indians that were shown, the
They,
Native American vendors or sellers.
were they in the courtyard?
Were they usually in the courtyard or was, I guess the question would be, was that just a publicity?
They were outside the Indian room.
They were outside
the Indian building.
But they were also outside the dining, the little
Also
cafe.
outside the dining room courtyard.
They were outside the cafe, Bree sold
Outside the
their
cafe.
pottery out there. I
The
mean,
resold pottery.
Yeah.
Any comment there for you, Mike, Matt, on Native American vendors?
I'd imagine that they probably were positioned everywhere, anywhere that they could make a sale. But most often, I think we're probably mostly along the walkway to the Indian building itself or along the platform.
One question and then we'll have to.
Well,
Sure.
I just want to share a little something with you folks.
Roland.
What I remember, I grew up in Santa Fe. And I used to come to Albuquerque with my grandfather. And whenever he had business clients to deal with, they would meet at the Alvarado. That was the happening place. And this had to be early 60s.
Early 60s,
And
always had business. contacts.
The other thing that didn't come across, and I know you can't cover everything, but it was a happening place with a lot of people moving around. And
It was a happening place. A lot of
many
people-
trains coming in and out,
Many
just not
trains
one or
coming
two
in
a
and
day. And the other thing was the Indian room was intriguing, the gardens were intriguing, and there was demonstrations going on. I remember demonstrations of pottery and
Demonstrations of
weaving.
pottery and weaving
And
in
I
the
remember
gardens.
this one lady, she asked,
There's one lady.
she asked my grandfather, do they speak English? And, you know, I must have been 8 or 9 years old, and I didn't live in Albuquerque,
but I knew up in Santa Fe about the problems of them tearing down the Alvarado. And my mom made the comment to me, she said, they'll never get our La Fonda. So-
You can will do it for questions. If you have any other questions, I can submit them to Matt. He and I correspond on a fairly regular basis. But I thank you for coming today. Again, September 22nd at 2 o'clock, Joe McKinney and I will be covering the final days of the Alvarado and the efforts to save it. So remember the Alvarado.